This video is part one of a two-part series. Mendocino County, my home. And home to a population just shy of 100,000 other people. Nestled in the coastline of Northern California, Mendocino is perhaps the last frontier of the United States, and has a long and storied history. But allow me to give you the short and skinny of it. I'm your favorite hobby historian, Mr. Minarchist, and I'm just about finished visiting home for the summer. But as I promised in my last video on the Independence Day celebrations, which I highly recommend, I'm going to give you a rundown of the history of my home county here in Northern California. Also, most of my videos up to this point I've attempted to produce a more unbiased commentary. However, this time around, I will at certain points inject my personal political philosophy. So, if that isn't your cup of tea, and you might be a viewer who simply wants to watch a simple travel vlog / semi-documentary, then don't worry, please don't click off. I will warn you well in advance before beginning my rant. Without further ado, here it is, the history of Mendocino County in all its glory. Antonio de Mendoza, or if we are going by the Spanish that's spoken in Spain, then it would be Antonio de Mendoza.
No, I haven't seen Francisco.
A Basque conquistador, statesman, poet, and, well, ethnic cleanser. But don't think he was only killing the native populations of California. No, he enjoyed killing fellow Spaniards as well, particularly if they dissented against his iron-willed rule. Upon subjugating all of Peru under his iron fist with no velvet glove to be found, King Charles of Spain and his mighty chin knew that he was the guy to lead New Spain. New Spain being located in what is now Mexico and the southwestern United States. Obviously, that encompasses Mendocino County. So our man Mendoza here shipped out towards Cape Mendocino, cutting a bloody swath through what he described as the savage and the godless, and the ill-mannered and disobedient. However, very quickly afterwards, all of New Spain was running smoothly. Either way, Cape Mendocino, and thusly our county, is named for him. And of that fact, it's time to inject my personal opinion. Okay, so look, despite the current day push to rename controversial locations due to the terrible people they might be named after here in America, I think that's simply, as a concept, well, bogus. Was Antonio de Mendoza a terrible genocidal maniac? To us, yes. But to those of his time, he was an apt warrior and damn good at his job. My point being, I believe the biggest intellectual fallacy one can commit in studying history is to apply our own morals of today on those with an entirely different set of morals over 500 years ago. If we prescribed 21st century morals onto anyone from centuries prior, well, then everyone would look like a dick. Besides, Mendoza only landed in Cape Mendocino, and aside from that, he really spent no time up here at all. In short, I think such namesakes help us remember the past and also remind us not to repeat it. Okay, I'm off my soapbox for now.
Came from Salem City with a washbowl on my knee. Going to California. The gold dust for
Moving a little forward in time, Mendocino County never had a significant population during the Spanish and subsequent Mexican rule, and after a brief conflict with Mexico and Texas, we went to war in the 1840s, and concurrently, the California Gold Rush began in 1849, and, well, partner, there was gold in them hills. Unfortunately, not in Mendocino's hills, but Mendocino offered something just as valuable: fertile land for ranching and farming, and massive forests for timber.
every time I
Mendocino would become one of the first counties in the newly claimed California in 1850, and destinies sure were manifesting. Folks from the eastern United States were flocking to California in droves, and our very own Mendocino was no exception. However, perhaps I misspoke, as Mendocino wasn't entirely our very own just yet. When I said Mendocino was sparsely populated, I meant by Spaniards and Mexicans, but in the thick redwood forests, rolling plains, and rocky coasts, an adversary that Americans in the East were all too familiar with roamed. Except when it came to the natives in this region, the American settlers were quick to figure out that these particular tribes were among the most fearsome and battle-ready. There's a reason why the Spaniards didn't venture too far inland, and the names of those reasons were the Yuki, the Pomo, the Cato, and the Wintoon. These tribes were obviously upset about the repeated incursions into their respective territories, and with atrocities being carried out by both the tribes and the American settlers, mainly in the form of revenge massacres. For example, the settlers would wipe out a small tribal post. The natives would respond by slaughtering an entire wagon train, and this would ultimately continue until tensions eventually exploded. Through the 1850s, Mendocino County was beginning to burst into an all-out conflict. The settlers had lobbied the U.S. Army for support several times, but to no avail, leading to one man to take matters into his own hands. A group of cavalry veterans that lived near the Eel River watershed had formed the Eel River Rangers, under Commander Walter S. Jarboe. We have no official depiction of Jarboe, so for all intents and purposes, this is him. Either way, the Eel River Rangers were brutal in their pursuits, with men, women, and children not being exempted from their wrath, and this was in part to their not having an official state sanction over their actions. At the conflict's beginning, all of the tribes I had mentioned earlier were involved to some extent. However, it would be the Cato that would surrender nearly immediately, and even then they rarely participated in the bloodshed leading up to the war, the Wintoon as well. But the Yuki and the Pomo returned the brutality waged against them in spades. Now, whoever started the escalation is unfortunately lost to history. The settlers claim that 70 whites were massacred by the Pomo, while the Pomo alleged that 60 of theirs were slain in cold blood. However, the fact of the matter is that Jarboe was essentially instructed to wage war by the then governor of California, John B. Weller. However, Jarboe instead waged a genocidal campaign against the Yuki tribe, with such brutality that the U.S. cavalry had to intervene, rather than ragtag groups of angry settlers. By the time the U.S. cavalry intervened, the damage was done. Jarboe had massacred over 400 of the Yuki and Pomo alliance, and had taken almost 300 prisoners to the Nome Colt Farm, a reservation that was essentially a death sentence. The Yuki virtually ceased to exist, and the Pomo were no longer in any condition to continue the fight by 1860. Since the Cato and Wintoon surrendered early, they were allowed to form a reservation in their territory, but they too were practically shadows of their former selves. The Wintoon would later be relocated, and the Pomo tribe would be split in two, with one half of the tribe remaining in the Round Valley area reservations, and the other half being marched to the coast near the settlement of Westport on the orders of Colonel Braxton Bragg, the namesake of the town of Fort Bragg in Mendocino County. These events would later come to be known as the Californian Trail of Tears. After the bloody Mendocino War in the 1860s, the county began a period of rapid industrialization. Lumber mills and logging camps became a common sight, and the lumber yield from the massive redwood trees became a hot commodity in the whole of the United States, and thus the rise of the lumber barons had just begun. And boy, were they maximizing profits.
What color's your brigade?
Yes, in Northern California, lumber was king. However, something would soon threaten the blossoming industry. The Civil War would go on to rock the nation, and despite being well on the other side of the country, Mendocino County was still just as affected. And soon, all of California was mobilizing its wartime economy to crush the rebellion, which the Californians saw as just really harshing their buzz, man. Well, most Californians, as oddly enough, to the south of Mendocino County, there was a secessionist sentiment growing in San Francisco, which just goes to show that San Franciscans have just always been that way. Despite the war affecting Mendocino County, it did very little to hamper its economic growth. Soon, the settlers weren't really settlers anymore. They were citizens, with a great number of people being born within Mendocino County rather than migrating there. And the Mendocino War was fast becoming a distant memory despite only occurring a handful of years prior. Settlements were becoming towns, with Rancho Yoqueo, Yoqueo being a Pomo word meaning deep valley, becoming the city of Ukiah. And a settler named Hiram Willits would start the settlement of Little Lake, later called Willitsville and then Willits. But these blossoming towns would still be sparsely populated until the start of another great chapter in American history. Yep, that's right, the beginning. Although, from what I've told you, you'd think that Mendocino was at the heart of the Wild West. But the period that has come to be known officially as the Wild West wouldn't start until after the Civil War. Once the Confederacy was defeated, many former soldiers on both sides of the conflict would head west in search of a brighter future. Primarily former Confederates who left their beloved South rather than see that damn Yankee Reconstruction take root. And it was certainly very many from that walk of life that would cause a massive population boom in Mendocino County, which would be a hot point in starting one of the bloodiest feuds in our county's history. So why don't you join me for a game of 19th century Family Feud? What happens when you cross two families with a set of incredibly different beliefs regarding the Civil War while adding guns to the mix? Survey says, nothing good. And yet, this was the case in Willits in the years following the Civil War, back when the town was known as Little Lake. A bitter rivalry between two families broke out. Of course, this makes for a great, legendary tale. Two feuding families, like that of the Shakespearean Capulets and Montagues. Except if the Montagues were, cool with owning slaves. The Frost family were newcomers to Mendocino County, and were known Confederate sympathizers, whereas the local Coates family believed in the Union forever. Personal opinion alert, but Byrne and Sherman did nothing wrong. Either way, at this time, most families in the area are like most families today. They happen to hold their own beliefs, but none were so outspoken about them as the Coates were, and when a couple of loud-mouthed Reb lovers came to town, they were obviously thrilled. Mind you, this was at a time when political intrigue was at a boiling point in America, which just goes to show that Americans have just always been that way. But how exactly did the Coates feud with the Frosts end? How did the rest of Mendocino County's history turn up?
And if you've come this far, maybe you're willing to come a little further.
Exactly right. You'll just have to join me for part 2. Or, you could just Google it, but I'm gonna tell you anyway, and come on, it'll be more entertaining if you just sit tight. Anyway, I've been Mr. Minarchist, and remember, keep your heads on a swivel out there. It's a big, big world.